In 2022, a Chinese American might still be running a laundromat, but she could also simultaneously be a superhero that saves the whole world across the multiverse. And yes, I am talking about Michelle Yeoh's new role, not so new anymore, Michelle Yeoh's role as Evelyn Wang in Everything Everywhere All at Once. I think it's pretty safe to say that this film really took Hollywood by storm, but it's only one of the many Asian American productions that have came out in the recent years that have made some ripples, but was also trying to diversify the representation of Asian Americans beyond cliches. But meanwhile in China, Chinese diaspora content does not nearly get as much spotlight. For those people who do talk about it here, many are still grappling with how to connect with this. Some find the supposedly Chinese elements highlighted in these films and books foreign, actually, while others argue that being diaspora, after all, is a different identity than being Chinese. Here at the World of Chinese, we have been following Chinese diaspora creatives and cultural trends. And today, in episode 4 of Meanwhile in China, we chat with writers and scholars about trends in diasporic literature and how we connect with them with our own various diasporic identities. If you like what you hear today, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the bell to know when our next episode is coming out. I'm your host today. My name is Chu Si. You can call me Si. I am the culture editor of The World of Chinese. We're an English language magazine focused on in-depth reporting on Chinese society and culture beyond the headlines. Here with me in the studio are Emily Jing. Do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Emily Jin, Jin Xueni. I am a science fiction translator who's still working on translating from Chinese to English and the other way around. And I'm also currently a PhD candidate at Yale University, majoring in East Asian languages and literature.
And then we also have Hattie Liu.
Hi, I'm Hattie. I used to be the managing editor of The World of Chinese, along with Si here. In the fall, I will be starting a PhD in media communications, which is why I'm no longer in my position. But previous to that, I had worked as a journalist on China and within China for nearly 10 years, writing and editing about various issues in Chinese contemporary culture and society.
And last but not least, joining us via Zoom from Paris is Fiona.
Hi, my name is Fiona Silohan. I'm a fiction writer, poet, literary translator, editor, and Zheng harpist. I write and translate in English, Chinese, and French. My most recent publication is a novel and stories, Dear Chrysanthemums.
All right, let's start off by talking actually a little bit about Fiona's new book. Hattie, you've just read the book. Did you have anything to say?
I have just read the book. So for those readers who haven't read it, it's a series of you could call them short stories, but there are a lot of interconnections. So you see characters that are repeated, or possibly it's the second generation in the same story, Fiona, if I'm describing this correctly. So it might be somebody's daughter who's telling a story a few chapters or a few stories after the mother tells her story. And there are also other elements and characters that repeat. I really like that, how you were able to cover a lot of different time periods with that kind of a format. Although I have to say my favorite is still the one about it's a series of letters that told in a series of letters that someone is writing to someone who she says is her twin sister. But it's very mysterious. You know, you don't know why this person doesn't reply. You know, I always tell when I am editing things, I say I like it when writers show things instead of tell me things. So I guess it's not quite as on the nose as some of the other stories. And that's why I really, really liked it, because you don't know what happened because it's a series of letters. You don't know what's the relationship between these two women, what exactly happened with them. Besides having something to do with Chinese history, it was just a really awesome story in itself.
Well, thank you.
I also got started on the book, but unfortunately I haven't gone through, so I appreciate that you didn't give the ending away. So perhaps we can move on to some questions so Fiona can tell us more about the book that way. So one thing we were kind of struck by is the publisher's use of words in the synopsis of phrases like violence, survival, and especially past trauma that never leaves. It sometimes seems like these kind of phrasing could describe the genre of diaspora literature literature as a whole. So what do you think of the publisher's choice to frame the book this way, Fiona? What is behind your choice to set your stories in a traumatic period like the Cultural Revolution?
I would say that there's a certain level of intergenerational trauma in the book, inherited memories that we all sort of live with. When a writer writes from inherited experiences, we do have to look back and look forward, and that back and forth generates some level of tension in terms of the memories that we select, choose to present, choose to remember, choose not to. I approached it from a fairly literary perspective, using it as an artistic tool rather than so to speak, any political strategy, any socio-political perspective. Although that is somewhat lurking in the background, we have to understand that in outside the mainland and outside Asia, when you're an Asian, you are in a minority. And that's often a little difficult for anyone who was born in Asia and who grows up with that only unique experience to imagine the other's gaze. I wouldn't want to go into any identity label, any category. I just simply look at the one character and see how that psychological constitution and how the plot brings her to the stage of telling the reader or bringing through the story how she chooses her memories. And by that, in a very oblique way, we can get to see how the ethnic identity, so to speak, it's been brought through. I can't shy away from the fact that I am Asian. Of course, that's a fact. But I write in English. So we can always ask the question of what exactly, in what language I was thinking when I write. And of course it's English, but when some of the characters speak, it's fairly clear that they were in, say, France, they were in China, they were in New York, and the language they speak is not exactly what we might imagine in written English, but a transposition as a storyteller of what they say.
Well, I find it really interesting that you say that, when you're an Asian person and you're not necessarily in Asia, you're subject to this gaze from the other. I think that what's really struck me about that phrasing in the book synopsis is that, I did grow up partly in China and partly outside of it. But I do feel like a lot of people do see me as having traumas that never leave. And maybe because they're so often represented in literature, I don't see myself or my family as being made up of traumas that never leave us. But perhaps when other people see me, they see Cultural Revolution. They want to ask how that impacted my family.
There's this one, like my personal literary pet peeve actually, is when, why is it that when we read a piece of literature that's by a diasporic writer, why is it that you always have to read it as some kind of like a representation of their own life and not as just literature? So I think that's one problem that I can never get over when I'm looking at comments on diasporic literature.
Would you say that describes your experience too, Fiona?
Unfortunately, it does seem that it's hard for others to see us past our appearance. And particularly as women, you get the label as a woman author on your head. What Emily has brought up is the very important question about authorship.
Mm-hmm.
Read a piece of work as a piece of work in itself without the interpretation of a reader in terms of the authorship and the confusion of the author with the narrator.
to jump in on that again. So we had a discussion in this office before about the translation of the three-body problem. So originally it was serialized in science fiction world, and it started with political events taking place in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. And then when it was published as a book, the reason the publisher gave was that it wasn't sci-fi enough. The first 4 chapters didn't have any sci-fi in it. So they started somewhere like with more sci-fi elements, and the Cultural Revolution was, I think, chapter
11 or
something like
somewhere in the
middle. You
middle.
remember the number of the chapter.
But then when it got translated into English, the Cultural Revolution chapters were back at the beginning. So that kind of, to me, that does indicate a little bit about how the publisher in a Western market identified the Chinese characters, like how or what the story was trying to convey, like what did they feel was the important framing. It became not the science fiction and the aliens and those aspects, but the political aspects.
I've actually gotten asked a lot, especially in a Anglophone context, of, why is this chapter moving? Why is it so important? Is it really because, you can't publish this in China, that's why they moved it and all of that. So they kind of disproportionately, I would say, put so much effort in trying to make the censorship seem at the very middle of the whole event. One thing that I agree with Hattie here is that people often overlook the idea of, when you have an action, there's also a reaction. That the market itself, this entire huge beast that is the Anglophone literary market, plays such a huge role in the translation of the three-body problem that, moving this is for and foremost a commercial consideration.
I would tend to, as a writer, differentiate the writing lie from the publishing lie.
You as a diasporic writer, do you think that part of identity makes this process any more complicated than if it were for an Anglo-Saxon writer writing in English?
Not in my case, but it doesn't mean that in my case it has never happened, that it might not happen to other Asian American writers or poets. So it's a very individual case by case, and also depends on the personality of the writer and the translator, how she or he approaches the situation. If you go into a room and keep declaring your skin color, then that's the only thing that people are going to talk about, and that's not interesting. I mean, I want to be conservative in what I say, but that's not interesting. As in, what I meant is, it's not interesting to just switch the camera on just one that focus. Otherwise, it's just like saying that, I'm an Asian, so therefore all my life I can only eat dim sum.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we can afford much more diversity than that.
Yeah. I remember last time when we chatted, you also mentioned how the diasporic identity, or how a person outside sees the identity, can pigeonhole a writer into certain kinds of expectation. Like you just mentioned, like if you're Asian, you're supposed to just do this or that. That's kind of also a limiting aspect, sounds like.
There used to be quite clear boundaries, I find, in the literary publishing world between, what is Chinese literature and what is diaspora, which usually means Chinese American literature. And but I think these identities are becoming very blurred, at least how, outsiders might still see, or people unfamiliar with the culture might still see, are you Chinese? Are you diaspora? Are you overseas Chinese? But we see a lot of, for example, people like me, we were born in China, but we grew up abroad. Sometimes people, Yang Ge, for example, she used to also write in Chinese, but she has just released books in English. So that's something she is starting to do. And there's also, there are writers, there are poets who have would straddle these traditional boundaries and would even do that in their work as well. They might write in both English and in Chinese. And that's one interesting trend that I'm really excited to see. And actually, I think Emily's book, The Way Spring Arrives, the book that you edited, which features non-binary and female Chinese science fiction writers, as well as what I find even more interesting, your translators, the translators who worked on each story, I think also represent and straddle lots of different identities.
I think one important part is that personally, as a translator, growing up as someone who crosses between cultures, like we're all kind of doing here, in the beginning, when I first started living in North America, largely, I felt like, I inhabited the identity of the traditional sense of like Chinese diasporic creator. But now that I'm back in China more, I'm feeling kind of like a reverse cultural shock in that sense as well, that I also no longer feel entirely Chinese myself. The blurring of these identities actually gave rise to what I call, our generation of translators. So that notion actually leaked a lot into the way that we're putting our anthology together, is really that there's so many authors featured of various different gender identities as well. And having lived, in China and outside of China to different extents. So putting all that together, I think the making of the story is truly a process of all of us are translating ourselves to each other. And one thing that we tried in matching the translator with the writer is to see, what is their previous work? What is their demographics like? We really tried to choose a good translator for every writer and to make that like match pair happen. So I did a lot of matchmaking basically, and that was really fun. And I think that's also something that's often overlooked in the past when translators were not viewed as such prominent beings. But now we kind of afford the luxury of actually enabling that discussion of talking about what is actually a translator's style and how does that impact the way they translate.
Yeah, and before we continue, I think we didn't really introduce When Spring Arrives, so maybe just a few words about what that is, and then when you said the curation of translators, how the working process was like.
Yeah, sorry. So giving some background information, The Way Spring Arrives and Other Stories is published by Tor.com, and Storycom, which is a Beijing-based science fiction incubatory company. So it's a collaboration between the one press based in New York City and the other based in Beijing, basically. We call it the first ever team of women and non-binary creators, science fiction, fantasy, and general speculative fiction anthology in translation, featuring many authors who previously, for example, were not associated with science fiction, but they do their works more in the what we call kind of mainstream literature circle, also featuring writers who's never been translated before. But most importantly is that we keep this limited to this all-women and non-binary cast, because I personally think Chinese science fiction is too much about men, like in general.
Yeah, I don't know. To respond to that, so we were speaking of Fiona's book earlier, and what I liked about a lot of the stories is that, sorry,
you have the book up here.
Yes,
Yay.
She doesn't. They don't just do Chinese things. So, for example, they might make a cultural or literary reference to something in Chinese history or in Chinese literature. But there's also, for example, there's a chapter with three women are doing yoga, which is, of course, of course, Chinese people do yoga, but they don't really do yoga in literature. That's not something you really see them performing things that are not associated with Chinese. And I find that, and so I connected with that. I guess that's an interesting facet of the diasporic identity I like to see more of in literature. We're not all quoting Confucius all the time. Sometimes, we also quote bell hooks. We can do all those things, and we can do yoga.
So I guess now is the time for us to maybe discuss a bit about the diasporic literature that we wish to see. The diasporic literature that we each like, or ones that we like to create more maybe, also.
That we want to write.
How do you want to go ahead?
So I thought about this, and I would like to read She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker. It's a retelling of the story of Zhu Yuanzhang, who is the founder of the Ming Dynasty, but told in a kind of like a secret history of if this historical character was actually a woman. And so you see that a lot of Chinese heritage being interpreted through lenses of what you might consider non-Chinese framing. And I find that super interesting. We are not saying, you have to erase all the Chineseness in order to have more universal themes, but that we can incorporate all those things together.
you say that you don't have to focus too much on the Chineseness, but I feel like it's also redefining what Chineseness is. Like, it's not just dragons and, like you said, dim sum or chopsticks, but it could be all of these things, like women doing yoga or, you know, a history that's retold in a gender perspective.
I mean, yeah, I don't want to say that you have to remove all the dim sum from your story
That's
for
true.
it to be a new interpretation of Chinese identity, because that's also a part of it, right? Yeah.
No, but not all
Yeah,
of it.
yeah.
Ken Liu is a writer that I admire a lot. And his most recent concluded, I think, trilogy, the Dandelion Dynasty series, is a fantasy that he deliberately incorporates lots of elements from not just China, but this pan-Asian, repertoire of cultural elements. And he tries to use those elements to tell the story of the American founding fathers. So I think that's one piece of work that I really want to recommend, that from like a plot summary, it doesn't show the whole picture, but once you get yourself into it, you'll definitely know what he's doing to basically reimagine both a traditionally, I'm using this word sarcastically, white American establishing story, but also reimagining what we define Chinese culture as, especially traditions.
Yeah, I can also share a bit from my own perspective. So I told Hattie that I consider myself half diaspora because I was born and raised here, and I moved to the U.S. for a good number of years since high school. I studied there and I worked there. And I think for me at the time when I was abroad, what was really grounding for me in terms of diaspora literature were not really from people whose family have been outside of China for generations and looking back at the history, which was also a refreshing perspective for me because a lot of even like the trauma that we were talking about, that wasn't something that I was privy to while I was reading literature within China. And when I went outside, I read some works that kind of, for example, The Wild Swan, kind of strings together generations of individual story, but putting that into a place where it illuminates a political, cultural, a moving society. So that was a new way for me to perceive my own background, but also what was really grounding at the time were actually works maybe by more in Chinese, but by writers who also moved abroad and stayed there later. For example, Bai Xianyong, who went to the U.S. for school in his 20s, late 20s almost, and then just settled down there. So a lot of what he mentioned was kind of how this, not just like a distance from your culture, but literally being uprooted from one place and plugged into another. I felt seen when I was reading those works, even though they tend to be really sad, and that kind of like laid some foundations of how I navigated my own experience. But I think in recent year, I also started to wonder more of like, why does my diasporic or half diasporic experience has to base on this loss? I would say I'm still trying to find what that would look like in diasporic literature.
I'm a fan of Ted Chiang's.
Me too.
I don't see any of what we discussed in terms of Chineseness or whatnot coming out as a problem in his work. So I do believe it's possible to write beyond the boundaries. I wouldn't be more concerned with redefining or defining Chineseness on a personal level than redefining or defining humanness. Asian British writers coming up, Tibetan writers writing in English, and Hong Kong writers not just being translated but also writing in English in Britain, in UK, and also in US. So it's very much a 21st century situation or phenomena, if you want to call it, that is exactly as what all three of you have lived through, the diversity, the international, and the disappearance of geographical boundaries, and this introduction of geographical mobility, and that the fact that where one was born is not necessarily a limiting factor when it comes to such slippery terrains.
Great. Thank you all for such an amazing discussion, especially thanks to Fiona for joining us from across the continent.
Yes, and putting up with all the technical issues.
Yes, indeed. And I'm glad we are... Sorry?
No, you're very welcome.
Okay, just wanted to hear that again. But sounds like there's a lot more exciting trends that we could look forward to in diasporic literature, and I hope that our conversation continues in the future. And again, congratulations on the new book, Fiona.
Yes, congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Great to meet you across the screen.
So if you like the show, our dear audience, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe, especially the little bell that keeps you notified when we have new stuff coming out. Meanwhile in China is brought to you by the World of Chinese magazine. And if you want more human-centered take on what China is like beyond the headlines, go to theworldofchinese.com and subscribe to gain access to our latest articles, podcasts, and videos. Today's episode was produced by Hattie, co-hosted by Hattie and me, Si, and it will be edited by Aladdin Fache.
You're welcome.
And distributed by the World of Chinese Podcast Network. See you next time.